The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It tore through the cottonwoods like a dying animal, and Levy O'Connell felt it in his bones. He pulled his coat tighter, the worn wool a poor shield against the coming night, and took a step into the abandoned barn. He wasn't supposed to be here. The plan was simple. Cut across the old Brer property, save an hour's ride, and be home before the last light bled from the sky. A simple plan. But plans have a way of falling apart out here. Something had caught his eye. A shape. A low, dark shape against the golden hay. Too still, too quiet for any living thing. He moved closer, the crunch of his boots on the dry straw echoing in the cavernous silence. That's when he saw her. A woman. Maybe in her 20s, maybe younger. It was hard to tell. She was crumpled against the back wall like a discarded doll. Her dress was ripped, her skin so pale it seemed to glow in the dim light. Dust and sweat clung to her like a second skin. He knelt beside her, his knees cracking. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice rough, "can you hear me?" Nothing. Just a breath, so shallow and ragged it was more a flutter than a sound. He didn't hesitate. He stripped off his own coat, the last layer of warmth he had, and wrapped it around her frail shoulders. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed nothing. It was terrifying. He glanced around the barn, his eyes scanning the shadows. No horse, no wagon, no footprints but his own. Whoever she was alone. And she'd been alone for a long time. He carried her out to his buckboard, laying her down as gently as he could on a bed of folded blankets. His ranch was 5 miles north, a rough ride over unforgiving land. But she needed warmth. She needed water. And most of all, she needed time. Time she wasn't going to get out here. "Hang on," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He slapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, away from the barn and into the fast-falling night. The smoke from his chimney was a welcome sight, a thin gray ribbon against a bruised purple sky. He carried her inside, straight to the cot by the fire, and stoked the flames until they roared to life, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He worked through the night, a silent, grim vigil. He cleaned a nasty gash on her arm, a deep slice that looked far too clean to be from a simple fall. He spooned broth between her lips whenever they parted. She was burning with fever, her body trembling in violent fits. But as the sun began to hint at its return, the shaking finally slowed. Her breathing steadied. She was going to live. It was 2 full days before she opened her eyes. Levy was boiling water for coffee when he heard it, a soft rustle of blankets behind him. He turned. She was sitting up, weak but alert, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the cot. Her eyes, wide and filled with a weariness that went bone deep, darted around the small cabin. "Where?" Her voice was a dry, cracking whisper. "You're safe," Levy said, keeping his own voice low and steady. "Found you in the old Brer barn. You were half dead. I brought you here." He watched her try to make sense of it, her brow furrowed in concentration. I don't remember," she stammered, pressing a hand to her forehead as if to hold the memories in. "My name is Tessa Parkhill," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I came west with my husband. We had a plot south of the ridge." She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor. "He died. Fever." Her story came out in broken pieces. The husband dead in July, the food running out, then the unthinkable. Their youngest, a boy of 3, gone in August. Levy's chest tightened, a cold knot forming in his gut. He'd seen that kind of loss before. It hollowed a person out. But Tessa wasn't finished. "My daughter," she choked out, the words catching in her throat. "Violet, she's 5. I had to leave her, with another family. I was too weak, there was no food." Her eyes, swimming with tears, finally met his. They were filled with a desperate, pleading fire. I was going to come back for her. I was just trying to find help. Then I collapsed. Levy didn't need to hear any more. He nodded once, a single sharp movement. I'll find her. He left at first light, the promise hanging in the cold morning air. It took him 2 days. 2 days of riding, of asking, of following cold trails from one hardscrabble homestead to another. Finally, he found them. The Dobsons. An older couple with kind eyes and worn-out hands. And they had the girl. Violet Parkhill was a ghost, a tiny, rail-thin thing with tangled hair and enormous brown eyes that stared at Levy as if he were a phantom. She clutched a dirty, handmade doll and didn't say a word. He knelt down, keeping his voice soft. Your mama sent me. She's asking for you. The girl's face crumpled, a storm of emotions passing over her small features. She's alive? The words were barely a whisper. She is, Levy confirmed. She's getting better. And she wants to see you more than anything. Violet just nodded, a solemn, silent agreement. She climbed into his arms without another word, her little body trembling. The reunion was everything he'd expected. Tessa practically collapsed with joy. Holding Violet so tightly the girl squealed, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. They cried, they laughed, they clung to each other as if the world might try to tear them apart again. It was a perfect, beautiful moment. So why did Levy feel a chill run down his spine? That night, he sat on his porch, watching the stars ignite in the vast, dark sky. He should have felt good. He'd done a good thing. But something was wrong. Something didn't add up. Tessa came out and sat beside him, wrapped in one of his heavy wool coats. I don't know how to thank you, she said, her voice soft. You don't have to, he replied, his eyes still on the horizon. You gave me back my daughter, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You gave us a place. He finally turned to look at her. Her eyes were tired, yes, but they held a strength he hadn't seen before. A flicker of something else, too. Something he couldn't name. It looked a lot like fear. You're not alone anymore, he said, his own voice rougher than he intended. Not if you don't want to be. She took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt calculated. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. And as they sat there in the shared silence, Levy couldn't shake the feeling that the woman he'd saved was hiding something, that the story she'd told him was only the beginning, and that the real trouble hadn't even started yet. He saw the lie in her eyes the next morning. It was subtle, just a flicker when he mentioned the gash on her arm. I must have fallen, she said, quickly looking away, her hands fussing with the edge of her sleeve. A fall doesn't leave a clean slice like that. He knew what a knife wound looked like. He didn't press it. Not yet. He watched her with her daughter, Violet. They were inseparable, a tiny island of two in his small cabin. But there was a tension there, too. Tessa would start at every loud noise, the crackle of the fire, the slam of a door in the wind. And Violet, the little girl, she rarely spoke. Instead, she drew. She sat for hours on the floor, a piece of charcoal in her tiny fist, scratching strange shapes and lines onto scraps of canvas Levy had in a corner. They looked like maps of places that didn't exist. A week passed. The first snows of the year began to fall, dusting the hills in a fine white powder. Tessa was getting stronger. Color was returning to her cheeks. She started helping around the cabin, mending his clothes, cooking simple meals. She never once mentioned her husband again. It was as if he'd been erased from her history. One afternoon, Levy was cleaning out his saddlebags when he found it. Tucked into a fold of the blanket he'd used to carry her, something had fallen from her pocket. It was a small, carved wooden bird. A hawk, maybe, with intricate feathers and sharp, angry eyes. He held it in his palm, the wood worn smooth from years of handling. It felt important. He didn't know why. Later that day, he decided to ride back out to the Dobsons' place. He told Tessa he was checking his fence lines. It wasn't a complete lie. He just didn't tell her which fence line. The Dobsons were wary when he rode up. Mr. Dobson met him on the porch, a shotgun held loosely in his arms. "Something wrong, Mr. O'Connell?" he asked, his eyes narrow. "No trouble," Levy said, swinging down from his horse. "Just had a question about the Park Hills." Mrs. Dobson appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was pale. "What about them?" Levy pulled the carved bird from his pocket and held it out. "Ever see this before?" Mr. Dobson's eyes went wide. He stared at the bird, then at Levy, then back at the bird. "Where did you get that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "It was Silas Parkhill's," Mrs. Dobson said from the doorway, her voice trembling. "He was never without it. A cruel man, Mr. O'Connell. A very cruel man." Levy's blood ran cold. "They said he died of a fever," he stated, watching their faces carefully. Mr. Dobson let out a short, harsh laugh. "Fever?" he scoffed. "That man didn't die of no fever. He was murdered." The word hung in the cold air. Murdered. "The day Tessa brought the girl to us," Mrs. Dobson continued, her voice barely audible. "She was terrified. Bruises on her arms, a wild look in her eyes. She said Silas was gone, that she had to run. She begged us to take Violet, just for a little while. She never said he was murdered," Mr. Dobson added, his knuckles white on the shotgun. "But we knew. A man like that doesn't just die peaceful in his bed. He makes enemies." Levy's mind was racing. Tessa had lied. About everything. "Did she say who did it?" he asked, his voice tight. The Dobsons shook their heads. "She was too scared to say much of anything," Mrs. Dobson whispered. "But that's not the worst of it. A few days after she left, another man came by, asking questions." A cold dread settled deep in Levy's stomach. "What kind of man?" "Said he was the new sheriff over in Sweetwater," Mr. Dobson said. "Name of Brody, but he didn't act like no lawman I ever met. He had cold eyes, dead eyes. He was looking for Tessa, and he was looking for something else too, something he said Silas had stolen." Levy felt like he'd been kicked in the gut. A fake sheriff, a murdered husband, a stolen treasure. The woman in his cabin wasn't just a widow, she was a fugitive. And by helping her, he'd just painted a target on his own back. He rode home faster than he should have, the wind whipping at his face, his thoughts a chaotic storm. When he burst into the cabin, Tessa was sitting by the fire, humming a soft tune to Violet, who was asleep in her lap. She looked up at him, a small, tired smile on her face. "You're back early," she said. The picture of innocence. Levy's hand went to the wooden bird in his pocket. He stared at her, at the gentle way she stroked her daughter's hair, and a single, terrifying question echoed in his mind. Had he saved a victim, or had he just given shelter to a killer? He didn't confront her, not right away. What could he say? "The neighbors think you murdered your husband." He needed proof. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. So he watched. He watched her every move, listened to her every word, trying to piece together the truth from the scraps of her story. She was a good mother, that much was clear. She doted on Violet, her love for the child a fierce, protective flame. But when the girl was asleep, a shadow would fall over Tessa's face. She would stare into the fire for hours, her expression unreadable, her hands clenched in her lap. He saw the bruises she tried to hide, faint yellow and purple marks on her wrists and along her jawline. Those weren't from a fall. Those were the marks of a man's hands. One evening, while she was outside fetching water, he did something he knew he shouldn't. He went through her things. It wasn't much. A spare dress, a worn-out Bible, and a small leather pouch. Inside the pouch, tucked away beneath a few dried flowers, was a folded piece of paper. It was a wanted poster. The drawing was crude, but the name was clear. Silas Parkhill, wanted for armed robbery of a Union Pacific train. His heart hammered against his ribs. Her husband wasn't a simple farmer. He was an outlaw. This changed everything. He quickly put the poster back, his hands shaking slightly. He was standing by the stove, trying to compose himself, when she came back in. She took one look at his face and knew. Her own face went pale, the bucket of water sloshing in her hand. "What is it?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer. He just pulled the carved hawk from his pocket and set it on the table between them. Her gasp was sharp, like a physical blow. She stared at the bird, all the color draining from her face. The lie was over. "He was a monster," she whispered, her voice cracking. She sank into a chair, her body trembling. "He wasn't a farmer. He was a thief, a killer." The story spilled out of her then, a torrent of fear and pain. Silas was part of a gang, led by a ruthless man named Brody. They had robbed a stagecoach, not a train, and gotten away with a fortune in gold bars. But something had gone wrong. Silas had been shot during the escape. The wound wasn't bad, not at first, but they were on the run, hiding out in the wilderness. There was no doctor. The wound got infected. "He went mad," Tessa said, her voice a hollow echo of itself. "The fever, it twisted him. He became paranoid, violent. He was convinced I was going to betray him, steal the gold, and run." She finally looked up at Levy, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "He never told me where he hid it. He said it was our only hope, but he wouldn't trust me with it. He just kept raving, staring out at the ridgeline, talking about a sleeping giant." Her hands were shaking so badly she clutched them together in her lap. "That last night, he wasn't human anymore. He came at me, his eyes burning with fever. He said he was going to kill me, then Violet. He said we knew too much." She took a shuddering breath. "I fought back. I grabbed the first thing I could find, a cast-iron skillet. I hit him. I just wanted him to stop." Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. "He fell." He hit his head on the stone hearth. He didn't get back up. It wasn't murder. It was self-defense. A desperate act by a terrified woman trying to protect her child. The relief Levy felt was so intense it almost buckled his knees. He had been so wrong about her, but his relief was short-lived. "Brody," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "The man who came to the Dobsons. He's looking for the gold." Tessa nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He'll never stop. He thinks I know where it is. He'll kill me to get it. He'll kill us." And just as she said it, a sound from outside cut through the night. The sharp, frantic barking of Levy's dog, followed by a sudden, sickening silence. Someone was out there. They weren't alone anymore. Levy grabbed his rifle from its rack above the door, his movements swift and silent. He motioned for Tessa to get Violet and move to the back room, away from the single window. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He'd lived a solitary life, a quiet life. He was a rancher, not a gunslinger. But tonight, the fight had come to him. He peered through a crack in the shutters. The moon was high and bright, casting a silver sheen over the snow-covered yard. At first, he saw nothing, just the silent, sleeping landscape. Then a flicker of movement near the barn. A man. A shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the building. Then another. There were two of them, moving with a predatory slink toward the cabin. Brody. It had to be. He had found them. "Stay down," he whispered to Tessa, who was huddled in the corner with a sleeping Violet clutched in her arms. Her face was a mask of pure terror in the dim firelight. He raised the rifle, the cold metal a grim comfort against his cheek. He wasn't going to let them get inside. He wasn't going to let them get to her. He waited. Every second stretched into an eternity. The floorboards creaked under his weight. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, there was only the sound of the wind. Where had they gone? Had they seen him? Were they circling around? He risked another look. The yard was empty. Too empty. A cold dread washed over him. This was a game to them. They were toying with him. And then he saw it. A faint orange glow, flickering from the direction of his barn. It grew brighter, hungrier. Smoke. They had set his barn on fire. It was a distraction, a cruel, calculated move to draw him out. His hay, his tools, his livelihood, all going up in smoke. Fury, hot and blinding, surged through him, but he held his ground. He knew what they wanted. They wanted him to run out into the open, a perfect target. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He stayed by the window, his rifle steady, his eyes scanning the tree line, ignoring the roar of the flames. The light from the burning barn illuminated the entire yard now, turning the snow a hellish, dancing orange. And in that light, he saw him. A man standing boldly in the open, not 50 yards away. He was tall and broad, wearing a long duster coat. It was Brody. He wasn't even trying to hide. He was just watching the fire, a patient predator waiting for his prey to break cover. Levy lined up the shot. It was a long one, but possible. His finger tightened on the trigger. But then Brody did something unexpected. He raised a hand, not in surrender, but in a wave. A casual, almost friendly gesture. And then he turned and walked away, melting back into the darkness. The other man was already gone. They were leaving. Levy lowered the rifle, confused. Why? Why set the fire and then just leave? It didn't make sense. He watched the barn burn, the flames leaping high into the night sky, consuming years of his hard work. He felt a wave of helpless rage. And then he understood. This wasn't the attack. This was a message, a warning. We know you're here. We can get to you whenever we want. And next time, it won't be the barn. The fire burned itself out by dawn, leaving behind a smoldering black skeleton of a building. The message had been received. Levy spent the morning salvaging what he could, his hands raw, his face grim. Tessa worked beside him, her silence a heavy weight between them. They were trapped. Brody knew where they were. He could come back at any time. Their only hope was to find the gold and use it to bargain for their lives. "The sleeping giant," Levy said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "You said he kept staring at the ridge line, at a formation he called the sleeping giant." Tessa nodded. "It's a rock outcropping on the south ridge. It looks like a man lying down. He would watch it for hours." "Then that's where he hid it," Levy said, a new resolve hardening his voice. "We have to find it, before Brody comes back for more than just the barn." They left Violet with a fresh promise to return, this time with a neighbor Levy trusted, a stout woman named Martha who owed him a favor and knew how to use a shotgun. Then he and Tessa rode south, toward the ridge. The sleeping giant was easy to spot, a long, dark shape of rock against the sky. It was a massive formation, a labyrinth of boulders, crevices, and stunted, wind-blasted pines. It would take them days, maybe weeks, to search it all. They started at the base, working their way up, checking every crack, every overhang, every loose pile of rocks. The work was grueling, the air thin and cold. They barely spoke, their energy focused on the desperate search. Hope began to dwindle with each passing hour. The place was too big, the hiding spots too numerous. Silas could have put the gold anywhere. By the end of the second day, they had found nothing. They were exhausted, their hands scraped and bleeding. They made a small camp in a sheltered cove, the fire a tiny spark of warmth against the immense cold darkness. "It's not here," Tessa said, her voice flat with defeat. She stared into the flames, her face etched with despair. We're never going to find it. We will, Levy insisted, though his own hope was wearing thin. We have to. He looked at her, at the strength that had carried her through so much, now crumbling under the weight of hopelessness. He felt a powerful urge to protect her, to fix this. But he couldn't. Not with strength, not with a rifle. This was a puzzle, and they were missing a piece. Think, Tessa, he urged, his voice gentle. Did he say anything else? Anything at all? A word, a phrase, something that didn't make sense at the time? She shook her head, her shoulders slumping. He was mostly raving, about Brody betraying him, about how the gold would make us kings. He just kept drawing. Levy sat up straighter. Drawing? What did he draw? In the dirt, with a stick, the same shape over and over again. It looked like a spider web, I guess, or a star, with a line coming out of the top. A star. The word sparked something in Levy's memory, a flash of an image he couldn't quite place. He closed his eyes, trying to bring it into focus. A piece of canvas, scrawled charcoal lines, a child's drawing. Violet, he breathed, his eyes snapping open. Her drawings, her maps. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding with a sudden, electrifying certainty. She wasn't just doodling. She was drawing what she remembered. She saw him. She saw where he went. They raced back to the ranch, a frantic, desperate ride through the fading light. They burst into the neighbor's cabin, where Violet was sitting at the table, drawing on a fresh piece of parchment. They knelt beside her, their breath coming in ragged gasps. "Sweetheart," Tessa said, her voice trembling, "your maps. Can you show us the map of home, of our old cabin?" Violet looked up, her wide, innocent eyes moving from her mother's face to Levy's. She nodded slowly and picked up a piece of canvas from the floor. It was a crude drawing of a small cabin, a creek, and the ridge line behind it. The sleeping giant was there, a lumpy, reclining figure. But there was something else. A small, five-pointed star, drawn not on the sleeping giant, but far below it, right at the base of the ridge, and next to the star there was another small square shape, a shape Levy recognized instantly. It was the old Brer barn, the place where he had found Tessa, the place where she had collapsed from exhaustion, the place Silas Parkhill had used as his own personal bank. It had never been on the ridge at all. It had been right under their noses the entire time. They didn't wait. Leaving Violet with Martha again, they rode for the barn, the moon their only guide. The air was electric with a mixture of hope and dread. What if they were wrong? What if Brody had already found it? The barn stood silent and dark, a hulking shape against the starry sky. Inside, it was just as Levy remembered it. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight cutting through the broken slats. The smell of old hay and decay hung heavy in the air. "Where?" Tessa whispered, her voice tight with tension. He wouldn't have buried it deep, Levy reasoned, his eyes scanning the packed earth floor. He was wounded, weak. It had to be somewhere easy, somewhere he could get to quickly. They started searching near the back wall where he'd found her. They ran their hands over the walls, kicked at the loose hay, tapped on the floorboards of the empty stalls. Nothing. Desperation began to creep back in, cold and sharp. Then, Levy's foot hit something that wasn't earth. It was a loose floorboard in the last stall, one he hadn't noticed before. He knelt, prying at it with his fingers. It came up with a groan of rotting wood. Beneath it was a dark, hollow space. He reached inside, his hand closing around something hard and cold. Canvas. He pulled it out. It was a heavy sack tied shut with thick twine. He fumbled with the knot, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline. The sack fell open, and there, glinting in the faint moonlight, was the soft, unmistakable gleam of gold. They had found it. The relief was so overwhelming it was dizzying. Tessa let out a choked sob, half laughter, half despair. They had done it. They had a chance. But their victory was cut short by a sound from the barn entrance, a slow, deliberate clap. "Bravo!" a voice drawled from the shadows. "I knew if I gave you enough time, you'd lead me right to it." A figure stepped into the moonlight. It was Brody. And he wasn't alone. Two other men flanked him, their faces grim, their hands holding rifles. They were trapped. Brody's smile was a cruel slash in his face. "I have to admit I'm impressed. Silas was always the smart one, but he never gave you credit, Tessa, hiding it in plain sight." He took a step closer, his cold eyes fixed on the gold. "Now be a good girl and hand that over. We'll be on our way, and you two can get back to, well, whatever this is." Levy slowly stood up, moving to place himself between Brody and Tessa. "You'll have to kill me first," he said, his voice low and steady. Brody chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "That can be arranged. In fact, I insist. Can't have any loose ends, can we?" He nodded to one of his men. "Kill him. The woman, too. After you make sure there isn't any more." The man raised his rifle. Time seemed to slow down. Levy saw the muzzle of the gun, the man's finger tightening on the trigger. He braced himself for the impact. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream echoed from the hayloft above them. "Mama!" It was Violet. She was standing at the edge of the loft, her small face pale with terror. She must have woken up and followed them. Brody and his men froze, their heads snapping up toward the sound. In that split second of hesitation, Levy acted. He kicked the sack of gold, sending it sliding across the floor toward Brody, who instinctively bent to grab it. At the same moment, Levy lunged, not at the gunman, but at a thick rope hanging from a pulley on the ceiling, the old hay hoist. He yanked on it with all his might. A heavy wooden beam, loosened by the fire and held precariously in place, came crashing down from the rafters. It slammed onto the floor right where Brody's men had been standing, sending up a cloud of dust and splinters. One man went down with a cry of pain, his leg crushed. The other staggered back, momentarily stunned. That was all the opening Levy needed. He charged the second gunman, driving his shoulder into the man's chest. They crashed into the wall, the rifle clattering to the floor. Levy was not a fighter, but he was strong from years of hard labor. He rained punches down on the man, fueled by pure, desperate rage. From the corner of his eye, he saw Tessa scrambling for the fallen rifle. Brody, furious, had forgotten the gold and was now charging toward Levy. But before he could reach him, a shot rang out. Brody stopped dead in his tracks. He looked down at his chest, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. He looked up at Tessa, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. She stood there, the rifle in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. She hadn't hesitated. He took one more step, then crumpled to the ground. The first gunman, the one with the crushed leg, was trying to raise his pistol, but a small figure dropped from the loft, landing on his back with a surprising thud. It was Violet, wielding a broken piece of board like a club. She brought it down on the man's head with a fierce cry. He slumped over, unconscious. Silence descended on the barn, broken only by their ragged breathing. It was over. Levy stared at Tessa, who was still holding the rifle, her knuckles white. She looked at him, her eyes wide, and then she looked at her daughter, who was standing over the unconscious gunman, still holding her makeshift weapon. In that moment, Levy didn't see a victim. He saw a survivor, a warrior who had fought for her life and her child, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to fight alone again. The real sheriff showed up an hour later, alerted by Martha, who had heard the gunshot. The story they told him was simple. A gang of outlaws had tried to rob them, and they had fought back. The gold was evidence enough. With Brody and his gang either dead or captured, the terror that had haunted Tessa for months was finally gone. They returned to the cabin, the three of them, a strange and broken little group that had somehow, against all odds, become a family. Years passed, the world changed, but on their small patch of land, life found a steady, peaceful rhythm. The reward money for the gold was more than enough to rebuild the barn, bigger and stronger than before. Levy and Tessa were married by a traveling preacher the following spring. It was a simple ceremony, held under the wide-open sky, with Violet as their only witness. She wore a crown of wildflowers and held her mother's hand. The fear in Tessa's eyes was replaced by a quiet, steady light. The haunted look was gone. She still had nightmares sometimes, but when she woke up shaking, Levy was there to hold her until the darkness receded. He learned the landscape of her scars, both visible and hidden, and loved her not in spite of them, but because of them, because of the strength it took to survive. Violet grew up wild and happy, her laughter echoing through the valley. Her maps became more and more detailed, charting every creek, every hill, every secret place where the wild roses grew. She had her mother's resilience and her father's quiet strength. They were a family forged in fire and fear, bound by something stronger than blood. They had found their home, not just in the small cabin nestled in the hills, but in each other. They had saved each other in more ways than one, creating a life of peace from the ashes of a violent past. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was real, and it was theirs. What do you think is the true meaning of family? Is it blood, or is it the people who stand by you when the world falls apart? If you enjoyed this story of survival and second chances, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the wild.